Hello and welcome everybody back to a tier list for Deep Rock Galactic. This time we're going to be talking about Gunner's Overclocks in Season 3. Now Gunner's Overclocks did get a minor rework, but for the most part they're generally the same. We'll be going over a few that did get changed, somewhat directly and some others indirectly because of the season shift. So first up we have the Minigun as our first primary weapon, and our first overclock is a little more oomph. Now a little more oomph gives you 1 more point of damage, and it gives you a 0.2 second faster spin up. Both these are super good on the Minigun. Minigun benefits a lot from just having very little amounts of damage added to it. And then the spin up on this is fantastic if you want to take the tier 4 mod that increases your spin up time even faster, so you can have a 0.1 second spin up time. It is a really good overclock and probably one of the better clean overclocks, just in my opinion, in the game. It makes the Minigun feel so much more consistent, and I would put this one high up into A tier. I think it's really good. Then up next we have Thin Drum Walls. Thin Drum Walls increases your overall ammo, and it also increases your cooling rate. So your gun doesn't overheat as quick, which is pretty nice. Well, I mean, it will overheat just as fast, but it will cool down quicker so you can bring it back up. And extra ammo is nothing but a bonus. You can also take this with all the other cooling options if you want with the minigun and have a really long sustained fire with the minigun, which is super fun. And ultimately this comes at no downside whatsoever. It works with every build that you would want to use with it. Even if you wanted to use aggressive venting, I guess you could still use this. It wouldn't be as necessary, but still decent. Thin Drum Walls is probably a good B tier. And then we've got Burning Hell for our first balanced overclock. Burning Hell makes it so you essentially have a short-range flamethrower on your minigun. For the first 5 meters in front of your minigun, you will start burning everything in front of it, and your gun will overheat quicker. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, you can take this with aggressive venting, or you can take it with hot bullets and you build up the heat faster. You start shooting hot bullets so you can burn things at a distance, or you can then just overheat your gun and have a little bit more crowd control with the aggressive venting. Both options work really well, and it's all around a really solid option. I would probably put Burning Hell probably up into A tier, but it's on the very high end of A tier, maybe low S tier, because it's generally just a bonus to the minigun. It's really good on like Swarmageddon. If you really hate Swarmageddon and really love the minigun, this might be an option for you. There is another option for that too, but that's more of a fun one than anything. Up next we have Compact Feed Mechanism. This one is similar to the Thin Drum Walls, where we get extra ammo overall, but we lose out on our rate of fire. Now the minigun already shoots really fast, and you can take the tier 1 option to just make up your rate of fire, and then you'll be fine. And in that case, you're just getting all the extra ammo. It's also really fun to run this with tons of ammo, because it takes you forever to run out of minigun rounds then. But, I mean, there's no real hindrance to taking this one. It's generally just a bonus. I'd probably put this B tier. Not sure if it's as good as Thin Drum Walls. Thin Drum Walls is really nice just because of the extra cooling. This one's also pretty nice overall, but yeah, solid B tier overclock. Then we have Exhaust Vectoring. Exhaust Vectoring is also a pretty good overclock. This gives you 2 more damage overall, but increases your base spread by 250%, which might sound like a lot, but it's not that bad. And if you take the increased accuracy in tier 1, it's not really that noticeable from the regular minigun, at least the regular minigun without that mod, in which case you're just getting your tier 2 for free, and you can always stack this on top of it. It's a very basic overclock, but it's pretty good. I'd put this one on the low end of A tier, maybe high B tier. I wouldn't use it as much as like a little more oomph, because I find this one just a little bit more consistent, but it's still pretty solid overall. Then we have Bullet Hell. Bullet Hell is one of my absolute favorite overclocks in the entire game, and it was, I guess, sort of buffed in this latest patch. It definitely got an audio overhaul, which is awesome. It now sounds like bullets are, well, ricocheting off of everything as they just bounce around, which is really cool. What Bullets of Hell does is it gives you 75% chance of every bullet hitting a surface, including enemies as well. They then can bounce into another nearby enemy. This is random as to which enemy it picks. I don't think it picks like the closest enemy to it. It just seems to pick in a general area of where the enemies are. This comes at the cost though of your spread and your damage. You lose out on 3 damage, which is a big nerf to your damage, and you lose out on your base spread overall, which is very noticeable. You don't necessarily need to take the increased accuracy in tier 1 with this one though, because of the ricochet. It's not going to work super well at longer ranges, but with Bullet Hell, you've essentially made your gun into more of a crowd control option, which by itself isn't necessarily better than some of the other options you have for primary weapons. Like, I would argue things for the autocannon, if you want to go for more AoE, would probably be better for this job, and something like fragmentation missiles for the Hurricane would also be better for this job, but bullet hell is still super fun, and if you build it for full damage, it's really not that bad. You can run into ammo issues though, so it's sometimes really, really good, and other times it's just kind of more of a fun meme. And I think for the fun factor alone, I'm going to put this on the low end of B tier. I think last time I put it into C tier, but I think it's a B tier. Maybe it's an A tier in terms of just, it's an S tier in terms of fun. But in terms of utility, it can be a little bit less useful. Super good on like Swarmageddon though. If you really hate swarmers, or same if you really hate jellyfish, bullet hell might be your go-to then, because it will just shred through everything that's tiny. For our last minigun overclock, we have Lead Storm. This boosts your damage by 4, which is a huge buff in damage, but it makes it so you can't move. Kind of when you're using this, you can still let go of the trigger and then hop, and if you do bunny hops, you can still move around just fine with Lead Storm. It is a little bit difficult to do, at least to start out with. It takes some practice to get used to. The other downsides are that you basically have no stun chance and you basically have no stun duration. You can still technically stun, which can be useful for stopping things from spitting at you, like any of the spitting enemies. So web spitters, acid spitters, those two you're probably just going to kill instantly with this though if you hit them. It's better for like Praetorians and Trijaws. You can still stun them, and you only need that split-second stun for them to not spit at you, which is nice. Against everything else, the stun really doesn't matter anyway for the minigun. This one is really strong, and it's really good overall. I would put Lead Storm up into A tier. Honestly, I'd put it on the same tier as a little more oomph. I use a little more oomph more often than I use Lead Storm because I just like being able to move more freely with it, and the faster spin up is really nice. But Lead Storm like absolutely destroys any big enemy. So yeah, there's all our minigun overclocks. As you can see, not really a bad one to be had. Some situational ones, but for the most part, really good ones. Then we move on to the Thunderhead Autocannon, which we're gonna, I think, have a similar situation with, because first up we have Composite Drums, and Composite Drums gives you 110 extra ammo overall and cuts down on your reload speed. Reload speed really doesn't matter with the autocannon because the majority of the time you're just going to be using Born Ready and just let that reload your gun. You can also reload cancel the autocannon, which saves you about the same amount of time this one does, which, I mean, you can stack that on top of it and you'll get even a faster reload. Still not going to be super quick. So if you're taking Born Ready, then the reload speed's whatever. The maximum ammo is nice because it's just more bullets to fire out of the autocannon. I'd put it up into B tier. It's a nice overclock. Splintering Shell is great. This gives you 1 more area damage, and it gives you a larger AoE radius by 0.3 meters, which is pretty good. No downside there. It's really good for clearing up crowds, and it makes the autocannon just a little bit stronger against everything. So A tier. Up next we have Carpet Bomber, which is more of a specialized version of Splintering Shells in a way. This one gives you more area damage. It gives you 3 more area damage, but it cuts down on your direct damage by 7. And it does give you a larger AoE radius by 0.6 meters. So more radius than Splintering Shells, more AoE damage but less direct damage, which makes it worse against bigger enemies than something like Splintering Shells, but makes it potentially better against crowds. Honestly, they're kind of the same. It is fun to go with the full Carpet Bomber build with this one, or the full Flat Cannon build with this, and just have a super high rate of fire with a big magazine and just spread this against crowds. Works really well against crowds. Overall, this isn't really one of my favorite autocannon overclocks, but it's still good. The autocannon has nothing but good overclocks, so B tier. Then we have Combat Mobility. Combat Mobility gives you 35% more movement speed when using the autocannon, at least when you are firing it and moving around. If you're just moving around normally, it's whatever. Doesn't really affect it. It cuts down on your base spread by 30%, so you're more accurate. You also have faster rate of fire scaling, which is pretty nice for your tier 5s if you want to go with damage or if you want to go with armor on it, because if you take your tier 2 for damage scaling or rate of fire scaling as well, then after just 2 shots you will either get your max damage scaling or your armor scaling right then. It also ups your starting rate of fire, which is great. The main downside to this, though, is that it cuts your magazine size in half, so you go from 110 magazine size to 55. You could take the tier 1 and go back up to 110 if you'd like. Usually I just go with the ammo because I find it more useful overall. Combat mobility, though, is really solid. I like it quite a bit, especially if you want to go tank gunner. It is pretty nice. I'd put it up into A tier. Up next, we have Big Bertha. Big Bertha is kind of the opposite of like Carpet Bomber. This one lowers your magazine size by half, so again, you go to 55 rounds. It lowers your maximum ammo by 110, so you lose out on 1 full magazine, or I guess 2 full magazines in this case. and you lose out on your top rate of fire. However, you have 30% tighter spread, which is nice, and you get 12 more base damage. That is direct damage, and if you want to build this for direct damage, you can hit really hard. This is definitely your best autocannon overclock if you want to be hitting big single targets like Praetorians, Oppressors, Dreadnoughts. This one is the one to go to, and it's pretty solid to build if you want to go with more rate of fire, and or at least go back to the regular rate of fire and just want to build for damage. This one is pretty awesome for that, and I'd put it up into A tier. May or may not be better than these other two depending on the circumstance. On like a Dreadnought mission, sure. On something like an Egg Hunt, maybe these other ones could be a little bit better, but Big Bertha is pretty solid. Then we've got Neurotoxin Payload. Neurotoxin Payload is pretty crazy. This one lowers your damage and lowers your area damage. You lose 2 damage and you lose out on 5 area damage, but it increases your AoE radius to 0.6, same as Carpet Bomber, and it gives you the Neurotoxin status effect on it, which has a 50% chance of triggering with every shot. And this counts not just for the bullet hitting something directly, but also the splash damage from the bullet. So you can be splashing Neurotoxin to multiple enemies. The Neurotoxin will then do damage over time. It will slow all enemies, and it will mark all enemies just because you can see the Neurotoxin coming off of them. This one is really strong, especially if you take it with the tier 5 option for Fear. It is really good then because you're just spreading this out across crowds of bugs. This one doesn't work the best on certain mission types though. It doesn't work great against Dreadnoughts. You're just gonna have a direct nerf to your damage more or less with it. And it doesn't really work on robot missions. Ever since robot missions, Neurotoxin has gotten a little bit weaker. It's still really good, but just not on those type of missions because the robots are immune to the Neurotoxin damage. However, most of the time you're not really fighting them. You're usually fighting bugs, even more so now since Season 2 is over and we're not getting as many robot missions and the robots have been scaled back a little bit. Neurotoxin Payload, especially with the Fear mod, is really, really good because you're just fearing everything, slowing everything down, dealing damage over time, and just covering so much area and Neurotoxin that everything is just dying slowly from this. So I'm going to put this one up into S tier. It is fantastic for crowd control. It's also just really nice to have because of the slowdowns of it, especially if you like playing on the higher difficulties. Up next, then, we have the Hurricane, where we've got Manual Guidance Cutoff as our first overclock. And this one is another one of the weakest overclocks in the game. And this is going to go into D tier. What Manual Guidance Cutoff does is it gives you 33% more velocity for your missiles, which is really nice. That is a bonus to this. Downside is that once you release the trigger, you can no longer guide the rockets. You can just keep firing the rockets out and then make sure that you're out of ammo and you can still be holding down the trigger and aiming them. That is an option and it works against big swarms, but if there's any other time where you just want to guide the rockets in and forget about this, then your rockets will go off course. There's not really a bonus to having this thing because you can already do it without even needing this overclock. You can just pickaxe cancel your shot and then your shot will go straight where it was going to go anyway. That's an option. You could also just switch to your secondary and that would also be the cutoff. I don't really know why the cutoff is here as like a pro to the weapon. It's just a downside to the weapon. And it's not even like a crippling downside because it doesn't really affect that much. It's just a super meh downside to it where it just makes the gun feel worse. One of the best things about the Hurricane is that you can guide the rockets into stuff. Moving on to 2 much better clean over. We have Overtune Feed Mechanism. This one gives you 20% more max velocity, so almost the same as Manual Guidance Cutoff, but it also gives you 1 rate of fire, which is the main thing that you want on the Hurricane because it doesn't shoot super fast. And with this, it frees up your option in tier 3, I believe, to take the magazine size. So you can have a 72 round Hurricane with the higher rate of fire with it and a higher velocity. This one is awesome. This one is really, really good. I'd put this one up into A tier. It's all around a really solid overclock. Then we have Fragmentation Missiles, which is also really good. This gives you 2 more area damage and 0.5 more meters of effective AoE radius. That's really good too. The Hurricane's pretty good at clearing up crowds. This makes it even more consistent for clearing up crowds, and even if you're still just using this against big things, it gives you a damage buff. So A tier, very nice. Then we have Plasma Burster Missiles, which are a bit of a weird one. Plasma Burster Missiles make it so your missile can punch through enemies and explode multiple times. They can also swarm to the same enemy if you just hold it on that same enemy and they'll just go back and forth through it. You also have a faster turn rate, so your missiles are easier to control and easier to move. You have a lot of downsides with this though. You lose out on ammo, you lose out on half of your total damage, half of your area damage, half of your AoE radius, and 25% of your maximum velocity. So your missiles are traveling slower, you have less of them, they do less damage, however they can't explode multiple times and make up for that particular amount of damage. They also have one unique feature, and that is if you take them on an escort mission, you can one-shot the flying rocks with them. That's been in the game ever since they were added, so I doubt that's ever going to go away now, which is pretty cool. These can also work really well against certain big enemies, like you can harass detonators, you can harass especially flying enemies like Tri-Jaws or Mactera Goo Bombers with them. Main downside to having plasma bursters, though, is that they're not great against crowds a lot of the time, because if the missile hits the ground, it tends to just explode into the ground and not do anything, even though it's supposed to, explode multiple times. And if there was a way to make that a little bit more consistent, I think this one would be a whole lot better than it is currently. Right now, it's still not bad, and it's probably the best option if you want to take the nitroglycerin compound, because these are the easiest to travel far distances and hit multiple times, so that kind of benefits them. You could, of course, just go with the stun on them, and stun works really well too, because they hit something multiple times. It's very likely they'll trigger the stun. They do have some utility, but they're like a B tier. They're on the low end of B tier, high C tier, somewhere around there. Mine layer system lets you set up mines, so you no longer have the guidance system on your Hurricane, which does kind of suck. But at least you get mines. These stick in the ground, and then they take time to arm. Once they arm, they last for 15 seconds, I believe. And then any enemy running near them causes them to explode, dealing damage. This does give you a bigger bonus for your AoE damage, and they do scale off of AoE damage. The other downside is you lose out on like one magazine worth of ammo, which isn't a huge deal. Mine layer system is really good against grunts. It's really good against ground-based enemies. It's really bad against Mactera, though. It is not very useful at all, unless you get to like a really tight cave or something, like say Driller just drills a hole backward and you just stick these all around it. That's the only time that they're really going to be helping you against Mactera. They're really not good in a big open environment. They're not good at clearing up spitters either, if they want to sit at a distance and just keep harassing you. These are really, really good against crowds, especially grunts and Praetorians, any sort of swarm like that. They can be really good against dreadnoughts as well. And you can put fire on them too. Don't do that for dreadnoughts, but you can put fire on them and have fire mines, which is pretty awesome. Mine layer system is like A tier. It's probably like S tier if you just know that you're just going to get hordes of bugs, or you have somebody that's dedicated to taking out Mactera, and maybe you're taking this on like a Swarmageddon thing. Then it's really, really good. Outside of that, if you're taking on a Mactera mission, it's probably D tier. It's really not good with Mactera Plague. Then we have Jet Fuel Homebrew, which this one is pretty awesome. This one increases your maximum velocity. Your projectiles start out at max velocity, and you also deal extra direct damage with this. However, you lose out on area damage, you lose out on AoE radius, you lose out on mag size, and you lose out on ammo overall. So this one, you just want to directly fire it right at something, and there's less leading with this. So if enemies are moving really quick or moving in an odd pattern, you might be missing with this a little bit more. But it does do really high damage per shot and really high damage per second. It's great for taking on Dreadnought missions. I'd put it up into A tier. It can run into some ammo issues though. Although if you want to build this for full damage, you can make it to where it can one-shot headshot grunts and two-shot body shot them on any difficulty, so that's pretty awesome. Salvo module is an unstable overclock that doesn't come with like a downside at all. It's really strange. So what salvo module does is once you hold down your trigger, you no longer just keep firing them. You charge up to 9 missiles, and then you can fire this out like a rocket shotgun. None of these are guided. They just go in a big square formation. You don't have to charge up to 9. You can charge up to any amount that you like, whether it be 2, 3, 4, however many. And every one that you charge, you get extra damage overall on each of these rockets. So the more you charge up, the more damage you'll do. It's great for hitting big enemies like dreadnoughts with them. And you don't actually even lose the guidance system with this. You just have to tap fire the rockets one at a time. If you're tap firing them, then you can still steer them and hit enemies. So that's why I say it doesn't really come with much of a downside, if any at all. It's a pretty fun overclock, and I'd probably put this one up into A tier. It's great for clearing up crowds, and it's great for dealing high burst damage to big enemies. Up next, we have our secondary overclocks. And first up, we got the Revolver with Chain Hit, which Chain Hit is a C tier. It's a overclock that you throw on when you don't have anything else. What Chain Hit does is that there's a 75% chance that your bullet will bounce into another nearby enemy once you hit an enemy in the weak spot. That's nice. It's going to get you a little bit of value overall, and it's kind of nice to smack something else with the Revolver, because the Revolver does hit pretty hard, but you might hit an oppressor in the face and it won't do anything, or it might bounce into like a shellback and basically do nothing, or it might bounce into a Swarmer and yeah, it'll one-shot a Swarmer. but it's not as impactful as some of the other overclocks. I kind of wish chain hit would get changed. I made a video discussing some of the overclocks that I'd like to get changed, and these two definitely showed up on there. Chain hit's just kind of a boring overclock in my opinion. Then we got Homebrew Powder, which I'm going to put Homebrew Powder into B tier. Homebrew Powder on the Revolver is better than any of the other Homebrew Powders in my opinion. I still don't really like it with the randomized damage. This randomizes your damage between 75% and double damage, so you can do 200% more damage per shot with this, or anywhere in between. A lot of the time this doesn't really matter for the Revolver, because most of the time you are going to hit something and one-shot it anyway. It does help you kill big things a little bit faster, so if you really like using the Revolver on like Praetorians, it will get you a little bit of a bonus. It's just not really one of my favorite overclocks, and if it is one of your favorite overclocks, then that's perfectly fine too. I totally understand, because it is kind of fun high rolling every once in a while. Then we have Volatile Bullets for the Revolver, and this one's gonna go right up into S tier. This one is pretty crazy. This one gives you 300% more damage when an enemy is on fire, and if you're running something like Burning Hell on the minigun, or if you're running anything on the Hurricane and just wanted to take the napalm rounds, you can light things on fire pretty easy. You also have your fire grenade, which helps. Downside to this is that you lose out on 10 base damage, which really doesn't matter to the Revolver, especially if you're only planning on using this against big things that you caught on fire. You will kill big things super fast. Like, just try using this against a detonator. You'll kill it super quick, especially if you're hitting the weak spots. 6-shooter is a solid A tier overclock in my opinion. This is just a straight upgrade to the Revolver. You get a larger mag size, more ammo, faster rate of fire. For the downside being that you have worse spread, which the Revolver already has great spread anyway, so lowering it a little bit doesn't really matter that much, and a slightly slower reload. That's the only kind of downside, but you can take the reload speed in tier 1 and mitigate this, and it'll be basically the same as the basic Revolver. Then we've got our unstables here. First up, we got Elephant Rounds, which Elephant Rounds is pretty awesome. Elephant Rounds doubles your damage. It also halves your total spread, so you basically just get a little pocket sniper rifle with this. Downsides are that you lose out on a lot of your ammo, you lose out on some of your mag size, so you go to hold 3 shots rather than 4 shots. Your reload time is longer, your recoil is very noticeable as to how much more recoil you get, and the spread per shot is pretty noticeable then. You do want to take your time in between shots unless you're just shooting at something at point blank range. Elephant Rounds though is really nice because you can pick off things like Tri-Jaws with a single shot on any difficulty. You can deal massive damage to big things like menaces or detonators or oppressors at a distance. Again, it's just like your pocket sniper rifle. You just don't have very many shots for it, but you should probably have plenty of shots for your primary weapon, so Elephant Rounds is a solid little A tier. Then we have Magic Bullets. Magic Bullets gives you magic bullets, so anytime that your bullet hits a surface or hits an enemy weak spot, it then can bounce to, well, it is then guaranteed to bounce to another nearby enemy within 5 meters. This also gets you extra ammo, but it cuts down on your damage by 20, which is pretty significant. That being said though, you can build this all for AoE damage, and it's suddenly really, really good at that. You put explosive rounds on this, and you put chemical rounds on this, so it has neurotoxin rounds. And then all of your bullets hit, splash, and can spread neurotoxin to nearby enemies, and then they bounce and splash again, potentially splashing more neurotoxin to multiple enemies, slowing them all down, dealing damage over time, and it can just wreak havoc on crowds. You can just clear up swarmers, you can clear up grunts. Super easy with this. It's really good if you want to take a high damage primary weapon like Big Bertha or Jet Fuel Homebrew and you're worried about ammo. I'm going to put Magic Bullets up into S tier along with Volatile Bullets. They are very good. Next up we have the Burst Pistol, and our first overclock is Composite Casings. This increases your total ammo by 36, and it increases your rate of fire by 1. That is really nice for the Burst Pistol, and I would say it's a solid B tier or an A tier. Really good overclock. I like using it. It's probably one of my more used overclocks for the Burst Pistol. Just makes it feel a little bit more consistent. Then we've got Full Chamber Seal, which I'm going to put this one into C tier. I really would like this one to get buffed because it's not doing a whole lot right now. You get 1 more point of damage, which doesn't really matter that much for the Burst Pistol, and you have a 0.2 second faster reload. And these are still buffs, so if you don't have anything else, toss it on the Burst Pistol. It's not going to feel bad or anything like that, but I wish it was a little bit more impactful. And the main reason why I put it down here is because we have 3 damage overclocks for the Burst Pistol, and this one's just the least useful out of the 3 in my opinion. Then we have Compact Mags. Compact Mags gives you more total ammo, but it cuts down on your rate of fire and it cuts down on your reload speed. You can make up for those with your mods, whether you want faster reload speed or more rate of fire. Either one works. it's pretty consistent as a secondary weapon if you just want more bullets and you want to spray at stuff. So I would say it's like a low A tier overall. Experimental rounds is next. Experimental rounds gives you 9 damage, but cuts down on your max ammo, cuts down on your mag size. That does make the burst pistol hit pretty hard, especially if you want to specialize it for long range damage, for killing specific targets like Tri-Jaws, or taking out potentially oppressors or Praetorians. That can help, and it does make the gun a little bit more consistent. I think I'm going to put it into B tier though. Electro minelets are pretty interesting. These let you, well, set minelets down. So every time you fire a burst, there's 3 shots or 6 shots, depending on which burst you want, that stick into the ground, and then these arm. Once these are armed and enemies walk near them, they will explode, dealing electricity damage to that enemy, which deals damage over time and slows them. This comes with the cost of your damage and your magazine size, which is not really that big of a deal, and it actually makes you have pretty decent crowd control overall. They're not incredible by any means. They're not as great as something like Magic Bullets is for the crowd control, but they are pretty nice, and you can have blow-through rounds with these, so you can punch through an enemy and then set the minelets underneath them and have them explode. Electro minelets, I would say high B tier. I guess I'd put it higher than, well, I'd put it on par with that one. A little bit higher than like experimental rounds though. Up next we got micro flechettes. This doubles your overall ammo, gives you 30 more magazine size, halves your recoil, and halves your spread per shot, but it cuts down on your maximum damage by 11, which is a pretty significant amount. There's kind of 2 ways you can build micro flechettes. You can build it for all ammo and try to go for stuns, and that's a pretty decent option. That makes it so you can stun things like Tri-Jaws pretty effectively. It doesn't really seem to hit all that hard on the higher difficulties though. Going for more damage and then kind of going with some of the ammo does seem to help, and that's usually the way that I use it, at least recently. It is pretty nice overall for that build, and you can do some decent damage per second. It makes the gun feel a little bit more consistent. I think I'd put it up into A tier, just below compact mags. It's not necessarily better than compact mags though, because I would say compact mags is overall more useful because it doesn't really mess with your damages, and you don't have to build it in kind of this weird way, so it's more flexible. And then we have lead spray, which I would say is the best overclock for the burst pistol, and I would put this one high up into A tier. It's definitely above these other 2. I'm just going to set it here for convenience sake though. This one gives you 50% more damage for the burst pistol, but quadruples your spread. So you're not going to be using your burst pistol at long range anymore. You could, and just hope for the random bullets to hit something, which, I mean, if you hit a spitter, you'll probably kill it with 1 or 2 bullets. This is for getting up close and personal and dealing really high damage, and it does do a lot of damage per second, especially against dreadnoughts, against oppressors, Praetorians, anything that you can get right up next to and just keep firing this into it. It will kill them super fast. Then we move on to the coil gun, which the coil gun did get changed. I released a series of videos saying how strong the coil gun was and how busted the coil gun could be. That's since been fixed. There was a technique, actually 2 techniques that you could do that would give you 50% damage reduction the entire time with the coil gun, and it made triple tech chamber in particular insanely good, and it was probably one of the strongest overclocks in the game, just because you could abuse the bugs so easily and just have that permanent 50% damage reduction for the entire mission. Since then, you can't do that anymore, triple tech. You could actually do it with everything, but you needed to be out of bullets with the coil gun in order to do it, which is why you didn't even need overclocks on it for that reason. Since then, that has also been patched out, so let's go over these and talk about them. First up is Reatomizer, which is always going to be a weird and kind of derpy overclock, and I do say that meaning it in like the most fun way. What Reatomizer does is once you fire through an enemy and hit another enemy, well, the first enemy has to be affected by some sort of status, and it's only certain statuses. So if the first enemy is affected by, say, neurotoxin, and you fire through that and hit another enemy, it will transfer the neurotoxin to that enemy. The first enemy will still keep the neurotoxin though. This was really buggy for a couple of patches, where you could potentially take the elite status and put it on your Steve, and you could also put the elite status on other enemies, just making your missions way more difficult than they needed to be. So Reatomizer wasn't working for a while, and I think it is working now. It's still very gimmicky. It's a fun gimmick to use though. So a very fun overclock, but I'd probably put this like C tier. It's not really that great. If you don't have anything else, sure, throw it on the coil gun. It can be fun, or if you just want to mess around, it's super fun then. Then we have ultramagnetic coils. This one gives you a larger trail radius and a longer trail duration. That's pretty useful because the trail can have like the electricity status effect on it and do a little bit more damage over time, so that's nice. I'd probably put this one B tier. It's nothing super fancy. It's probably on the low end of B tier, but it's still an upgrade. Then we have backfeeding module. Backfeeding module gives you a lot more ammo, but cuts down on your damage. The damage really doesn't matter too much with the coil gun. The ammo also doesn't really matter too much with the coil gun either, though. So I would say that this one is more of a bonus, but it's not one that I use super frequently. You can take this with the slow charge or the stage charge mod in tier 2, I believe, for the coil gun, and get a whole lot of value out of it. You get tons of shots then. If you want to take that and you want to take the tier 5 electricity, it is really good for just crowd controlling everything. And for that, I'd probably put it up into A tier. It is really fun to take that. Mole makes it so you can pierce through more ground. For anybody unaware, you can just shoot right through the ground or through objects with the coil gun and hit things. I get that question pretty often when I'm streaming as to what kind of things can the coil gun do. And that is one of the big advantages of the coil gun. This makes it so you can pierce through even more surfaces with this. And every time that you punch through a different surface, you will get an extra 150 damage added onto the mole, or added onto your shot, which is really nice. You can make this so you can do a ridiculous amount of damage. You can actually one-shot the twins with this if you would like. It can be pretty crazy. And even if you're not going to that extreme, which granted that is kind of an extreme where you're setting up this whole obstacle course more or less so that you can do this, it still will get you a lot of value overall just for hitting normal enemies, especially like Praetorians or Oppressors or whatever it might be. It's pretty easy to get a surface in between you and them and just get bonus damage. And the downside to this isn't even that bad of a deal. It's just lower charge rate, so your gun takes a little bit longer to charge up, but whatever. This one's S tier. It's really good. Up next we have Hellfire, which Hellfire is another really good overclock. This one makes it so it ignites everything around in the area where you fired the shot, as well as your trail radius is much larger. Downsides of this, though, is that you lose out on ammo, you lose out on charge speed, and your trail duration is not as long as it used to be. And this used to last for 5 seconds, now it lasts for 3 seconds. This one's still fantastic for taking out robots, though, because if you fire this at any of the turrets, it will kill them just from the fire alone. It's also great for crowd control. You fire this into a group of enemies, as well as you can still punch through the ground and stuff, so you can fire this to protect allies, and you'll burn everything in a given area. It works really well if you combine it with the sludge pump from another class. Really good crowd control. I would put this one up into S tier, on the lower end of S tier, where Mole is on the higher end, this is on the lower end. And then our last overclock is Triple Tech Chambers, which I said did get nerfed. This one is no longer like S plus tier because of the bug that you could have with it. Whoops. It wants to go up there though. This one is still pretty useful though. This one makes it so you can fire your coil gun up to 3 times. This will cost extra ammo for each shot, and the other 2 shots past the first one cannot pierce through the ground, so you do have to remember that. Your reload speed is also hindered a little bit when you take this one. Your charge speed is a little bit slower, and the recoil is pretty noticeable between these shots. However, you can still take this with like the electricity in tier 5 and have a very solid weapon that deals good damage and still has pretty good crowd control. So I'd put it on the low end of A tier. Similar to backfeeding module, this one will get more DPS than backfeeding module and will get you more instant crowd control, but backfeeding module can get you more crowd control over time. So I think they're pretty comparable, and I'd probably keep them there. This is where I'd put all of Gunner's overclocks as of Season 3. Gunner still has a lot of amazing overclocks. Not too much change besides the coil gun getting fixed. Tell me your thoughts on Gunner's overclocks, though, down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Thanks, everybody, for watching this. I really do appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.